Hello, good evening, everyone, and hope you're having a wonderful day. And everyone who's watching us today is doing fine. Welcome to today's session on Master Speak. Last week, we heard the valuation guru, Mr. Aswat Damodaran, talk about the craft of valuation and how storytelling is a key driver of value. What an amazing session it was. Today, we have yet another superb storyteller or business romantic, as he refers to himself, who is extremely passionate about humanizing business. It's no surprise that our topic for today then is the future of business is beautiful business. So it's all about finding meaning in business. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce you all to Tim Leberecht. Tim is a German American author, entrepreneur, and co founder of the Business Romantic Society, a firm that helps organizations and individuals create transformative vision stories and experiences. He's also the co founder and co curator of House of Beautiful Business, a global think tank and community that brings together leaders and change makers with a mission to humanize business. Previously, he was the chief marketing officer of product design and innovation consultancy Frog Design, and he is also one of the most sought after keynote speakers, having spoken at numerous conferences. His TED Talks have been viewed by over 2.5 million times to date. Tim is also author of the book called The Business Romantic, published by HarperCollins 2015. It has been translated into 9 languages since. His writing regularly appears in publications such as Entrepreneur, Fast Company, Forbes, Fortune, Harvard Business Review, to name a few. And after 15 years in California, Tim returned to Germany in 2017, where he currently lives in Berlin with his wife and a daughter. And he's joining us today from Berlin. So before I hand it over to Tim, and I can't wait to hear what Tim has to tell us, let me just first check if everybody who's listening, who's tuned in, is doing fine and your families are safe. If that's the case, please press the like button so we know everything is good at your end. Make sure that you invite your friends, colleagues, tag them in the comment section, get them to join this session along with you. Learning is always fun when you do it together. Lastly, I'm sure you'll have tons of questions. Keep your questions coming in the comment section. I'm going to pick two lucky questions at the end of the show. So you got to wait till the end of the show. And I'm going to pick two questions out of the questions that we get from the audience today as lucky questions who will get Amazon gift voucher. But you got to stay till the end of the show. With that, I can't wait to hear what Tim has to share with us. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining us. We are all looking forward to your session.
Hi, thank you, Rakesh. Really nice to be here. I'm delighted, feel quite honored to be part of this Master Speak series by Future Generali. I hope you're doing all well. I'm joining you from Berlin, and I will share with you my vision for beautiful business. And I'm going to share my screen, so I hope this is going to be seamless. Here we go. Yeah, does that work? Okay, yeah, okay. Perfect. So I want to begin and actually make a confession, which is that I'm a business person, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a CEO, but I'm also an unapologetic romantic, even though my wife would probably dispute that. But I am a romantic, and I believe the world would be a better place if we had more romance in our lives. I believe we must find it and create it in and through business, because business is the most powerful operating system of our time. Now, when you hear the words business and romance, right, they're kind of like opposite pairs that don't attract one another. They're almost like exact opposites. And in fact, we often use the word romance or romanticizing to dismiss an idea as erratic or crazy or eccentric, but not valuable. And when I talk about romance, then I'm also not referring to candlelight dinners or that you should fall in love or run away with your colleague or boss. No, I'm referring to moments in which our hearts beat faster, experiences that make our adrenaline rush, and moments in which we lose control and fall in love with an idea, a project, an organization, or the whole world around us. Another way to describe romance is also to compare it to idealism and optimism. And romance is different, or romanticism is different. The idealist looks at the proverbial glass and wants that the glass always is all the way full, all the way to the top. The optimist looks at the glass and says it's half full, always. Now, the romantic looks at the glass and says, isn't it beautiful? But it is really, really hard to find that kind of beauty in business. Because, as this rather harsh quote by the Austrian author Thomas Bernhard shows, not a lot of us are actually very happy at work. In fact, many of us are miserable at work. The Gallup studies regularly show that only a third of employees worldwide are fully engaged at work. And there's even been a study by the London School of Economics that found out that there's only one activity that is considered less desirable than being at work, and that is being sick in bed. And maybe that's not surprising, because many of us, maybe not you, but I certainly have been in my career part of structures that look like this and really stifle joy, expression, and creativity, right? The regime of bureaucracy. And if we're honest and look back to the past 10 years or so, then we have to admit that the history of digital technology has not been a history of enchantment. In fact, digital technology has actually further enhanced the disenchantment to some degree that we have at work. The internet giants of Silicon Valley, they promised to create an internet that would make the world more inclusive, more democratic, better. And what did we get? Facebook. And not just since many, many scandals, the US presidential elections, Cambridge Analytica, other privacy issues, have we come to realize that the promise of a connected world comes at a high price, which is the loss of our data sovereignty. And a philosophy that's been embraced and endorsed by Silicon Valley that is all about reducing us to a binary data set and essentially to optimization and efficiency. And it's to be expected that this trend is only going to be accelerated and amplified by the so-called fourth industrial revolution, to use a term coined by the World Economic Forum. You probably have seen all the studies. 50% of the global workforce is to be expected to be replaced by software and AI over the next 2 decades, says the infamous Oxford study by Osborne and Fry. There are other more moderate outlooks that say, well, it's anywhere from 30 to 40, 45%. But the point is that there will be drastic changes to the way we work. And my friend and colleague Gerd Leonhardt, a futurist, I think he really put it best when he said, if you can describe your job in one sentence, then chances are you're not going to have one much longer. Which is to say that any work that is repetitive, linear, process-driven is very likely going to be replaced by a machine. And that's not only going to affect factory workers or taxi drivers, blue-collar workers, but also increasingly knowledge workers. To me, as a romantic, yes, I am concerned that machines will take our jobs and replace us. But the even greater concern for me is that we humans become machines ourselves, and that we begin to put microchips into our bodies, as some retailers have begun to do, to track every single move of our employees, to better monitor and control them in the sense of a surveillance economy, that we use so-called emotional artificial intelligence to survey and track and analyze and optimize and eventually manipulate our feelings, our emotions. And that we fall prey to the regime of the quantified self, the quantified workplace, where we may see the rise of apps such as this one, which is called Don't Worry, Be Happy. So what it does is it tracks your facial expressions at work when you're sitting in front of a computer. And if you stop smiling, if you stop being happy, it deletes everything that you've produced over the past hour or so. So a not so subtle way of social engineering at work. And this obsession with the quantification of everything, with our quantified selves, that has infiltrated the most private aspects of our lives. Case in point, this app here, Spreadsheets, which promised users to enhance their sexual performance based on a rigorous analysis of previous performances and the data that they produced. And if that doesn't work, you can use this app called Breakup Text that lets you send automated breakup text messages at the opportune moment. And it is to expect it now in the wake of COVID-19, or in the middle of it rather, that, yeah, we'll probably see a rise of other surveillance technologies, often with good intentions, however, with the possible consequence of reducing ourselves to something that can be optimized and engineered. And we've been at a point of such disenchantment before in history. 200 years ago, the Romantic movement, the writers, the philosophers, the poets of the Romantic movement, which came out of Britain, France, Germany, revolted against the prevailing philosophy at the time, which was the Enlightenment. And the Romantics said, this notion of empirical evidence and scientific rationality that doesn't do justice to the mysterious, elusive, multi-layered, mysterious human psyche and soul. So they revolted against it, and they espoused alternative virtues such as emotion or suffering, inconsistency, serendipity, ambiguity, mystery. And I believe we're at a similar moment in time. We need a new romantic movement, this time in business, and this time in response to the disenchantment caused by the datafication, the quantification, the automation, the optimization of everything in all aspects of our lives. Because as machines take our jobs and do them more efficiently, and they will, soon the only work, or at least the most important work for us humans, is the kind of work that must be done beautifully rather than efficiently. That means with empathy, imagination, with love, with care. But how do you do that? It sounds lofty, right? It sounds like a lofty idea, but how do you actually operationalize that? How do you run a beautiful business? How do you lead and work beautifully? And what are you going to do with this on Monday? So I'd like to propose 3 principles. I call them the 3 principles of beautiful business that might help you do so. First, do the unnecessary. I once worked at a company. I was the chief marketing officer. That was the result of a merger of a large IT outsourcing company and a small boutique design firm. We were bringing together 9,000 software developers, predominantly actually from Gurgaon and Bangalore in India, and 1,000 creative types, mostly from the West Coast in the US. 2 vastly different cultures, engineering, creative. And to unify these 2 cultures, we were going to launch a 3rd new brand. And the new brand color was going to be orange. Now, I remember that we were going through the launch plan of this new brand, and last minute, we, the management team of that company, decided to cut the purchase of 10,000 orange balloons, which we had meant to distribute to staff worldwide. I remember the CFO saying, those balloons, they're not mission critical. They're just cute, but do we really need them? So we cut them. We didn't know back then that our decision to cut the purchase of these 10,000 balloons marked the beginning of the end, and that these 2 organizations would never become one. And of course, what happened? The merger failed. Now, did it fail because we didn't have enough orange balloons? No, of course not. But the kill the orange balloons mentality permeated everything else. It became toxic. You might not always realize it, but when you cut the unnecessary, you cut everything. So do not kill your orange balloons. To lead with beauty means to rise above what is merely necessary. He knew this, Steve Jobs. Of course, he's in every presentation, but I actually have worked for a company, Frog Design, that had worked with Steve Jobs in the 80s and 90s. And our founder, Hartmut Esslinger, a German industrial designer, always shared these stories with me of Steve Jobs. And one really stuck with me. He said that Steve Jobs famously insisted on designing the interior of the computers, the motherboards, with the same love and rigor as the exterior. He said customers can't see it, but they can feel it. They can feel the love that went into it. And he alluded to the spirit, the soul of a product. And likewise, this German entrepreneur, Alfred Kercher, who founded a cleaning products company, once said this beautiful line. He said, our customers and employees are not staying with us because of what we do, but because of who we are. And again, he's alluding to the soul, to something more essential of an organization, describing a relationship to employees and to customers that is not driven by convenience or benefits, but actually by a notion of intimacy. And that brings us to the principle number 2, create intimacy. I recently came across a study that said that the average American, and I'm an American citizen myself, has only 2 close friends, sadly. And you can make fun of Americans' lack of social capital, but let me tell you, the numbers are not that different in many, many parts of the world. And they have deteriorated over the past few years, so much so that sociologists speak of an age of isolation, an age of loneliness, which is really strange, isn't it? Because never before in human history have we been so connected, have we been so communicative. I mean, we check our iPhone or smartphone 80 times per day, and yet we are more isolated and we are lonelier than before. How can that be? The author Richard Bach has an explanation. He says the opposite of loneliness is not being connected. It's not togetherness, it's intimacy. And we are in dire need for more intimacy in these digital times. So much so that there are somewhat obscure business models popping up already. This one is from the Hollywood Hills in Los Angeles. The person here on the right, his name is Chuck McCarthy, is a so-called people walker. So for $30, you can rent him, and for 30 minutes of your life, he'll walk with you. So think of it as sort of a concierge service for lonely people, or the Uber for human interaction. It's a bit depressing, but it shows you that the desire for intimacy, in this case facilitated by a marketplace, is indeed immense. But the question is, how do we design for intimacy at work for our organizations? And whom can we learn from? Artists. Artists are masters at crafting intimacy. Take this performance artist, Marina Abramovic, one of the world's most famous performance artists. She once held an exhibition in New York City at the Museum of Modern Art called The Artist is Present. And that's exactly what she was. She was just present for 750 hours. She sat there vis-a-vis one visitor at a time, 5 minutes each, just silently looking into each other's eyes, being present with each other, celebrating the kind of presence that is thick rather than lean and efficient. And this idea of silent interaction, of thick presence, this inspiration for Marina Abramovic was actually adopted by a theater company in my hometown in Stuttgart in Germany during the COVID-19 crisis, because all the theaters and the operas and the orchestras were of course shut down, still are. So they began to establish a concert series that they called one-on-one concerts, where one musician, respecting social distancing rules, was performing for just one listener at a time here at the Stuttgart airport. And the only rule was that the performance lasted for about 10 minutes. And at the beginning of the performance, you had to look into each other's eyes silently, very much like Marina Abramovic did. And it was a huge success, and it's still ongoing. And there are, of course, other ways to import this kind of presence into business. Meditation, mindfulness, which is becoming a very, very popular practice in many organizations around the world. SAP, the software company, they have a head of mindfulness and a very popular mindfulness program. Daimler, the car maker, has begun to begin certain meetings with silent minutes. Myself, I began to host silent dinners or take part in silent dinners. And I have to tell you, I've really experienced quite a few strange things in my career, but spending 90 minutes in silence over dinner with 30 German executives was one of the strangest things that ever happened to me in business. It was very weird, but then also really beautiful, because what happened after 10, 15 minutes is that the executives, they dropped their mask, they let their guard down, and we suddenly were able to communicate and to feel an intimacy, a tenderness even, silently, that we would have never experienced had we just met in a traditional networking event. So silence is golden. Silence is the big connector. This is also why we emulate these ideas and have a silent hour with which we conclude the annual gathering of the House of Beautiful Business, the think tank and community that I run. What is interesting, though, is, and many of you may share this experience, that yes, it is possible to create intimacy through distance, over distance, even on Zoom or other platforms. Over the course of the past 4 months during the lockdown here in Europe, in the crisis, in the middle of the crisis, we were hosting 45 what we call living room sessions attended by 10,000 people. We were silent together, we were journaling together, we were writing together, we were debating together. But we created a community, even though we were miles, thousands of miles apart and just on the screen, that really bore a sense of intimacy. And I believe as we go forward and create a hybrid remote workplace, creating intimacy like a painter over distance is going to be one of the key qualities that managers need to have. Now, how about intimacy in the customer experience? What role does it play there? One prime example for intimacy here is the Dutch organization Buurtzorg. Buurtzorg is a nursing organization, a caregiving organization, and they implemented some really radical changes a few years ago. They removed all hierarchy, the org chart that I showed you earlier. They removed all job titles, and instead they empowered small teams of nurses to make decisions themselves and do whatever was in the best possible interest of the patient. Now, two things happened. First of all, Buurtzorg grew, and they're tremendously successful, very popular among patients. They're they've just grown quite a bit. Secondly, the cost per patient went down, interestingly, which means that the organization became more effective. Why? Because it no longer relied only on aggregated data on customer segmentation. It actually relied on a very intuitive, intimate relationship that each of these nurses had with their patient. That was the secret of Buurtzorg's success. So we've seen intimacy in action at the workplace, among employees, colleagues, in the customer experience. Intimacy between human and human. Yes, that is possible, and yes, that is very important, maybe more important than ever before. But what about intimacy between humans and machines? Is that possible? It's a question that researchers have been exploring for a while, and there's a lot of research on that topic. There's one famous experiment conducted by the MIT researcher Kate Darling. So a few years ago, she held this experiment and asked the participants to spend time with robots, 2 or 3 hours, quality time to give the robots a name, hang out with them, build a relationship. And then, very abruptly, she asked the participants to torture the robot, to kick it, beat it, kill it, destroy it. And none of the participants was able to do it. In fact, some of them started crying. And she took that as evidence, and many researchers agree, that yes, we are able as humans to form emotional attachment to machines fairly quickly. Is that the same, though, as intimacy? I would argue no. Because intimacy requires a fundamental human trait that machines don't have. That is vulnerability. There is no intimacy without vulnerability. And there is no vulnerability without the ability to suffer. And the ability to suffer also correlates with another human trait. That is the third principle of a beautiful business, which might surprise you. It's the ability to lose. Now, I have to admit, I'm not just a romantic. I'm also, and not just a business romantic, I'm also a football romantic. And I am, unfortunately, for many, many years, this was a badge of honor, but right now it's actually hard to be a Barcelona fan. But I am really a card-carrying Barcelona fan. And of course, my heart was broken when Barcelona lost 2-8 in a humiliating defeat against, of all teams, Bayern Munich last Friday. This is a photo of a deflated Lionel Messi, arguably the best football player in the world, sitting in the dressing room. It's interesting, though, I've been sort of reflecting on my emotions about this loss that occurred last Friday. You know, as football fans, of course, we want our team to win, but what matters even more, perhaps, is how the team wins, especially for a team like Barcelona, but also how the team loses. And it was how the team lost that was so disturbing. And yet, at the end of the day, you know, even the most painful defeats like this one, they create actually a strong attachment, perhaps an even stronger attachment to a club than the most glorious victories. That's the beauty of football and of sports. Now, that is not the same in business. In business, we do not know defeat. We don't want to know defeat. We play always only to win. That's how we grow up in business. And look at all these books that have been written, and I wish I had read at least some of them. Now, I would argue, though, that in the future, we will all be losing, because we will be losing the stability and continuity of traditional employment. We will lose control over our brands. We are already losing control over our brands. We will lose the authority that we used to have in increasingly flat and decentralized organizations. We will have to switch between different cultures, identity, networks, projects. Again and again, we will have to enter and exit relationships more often, more frequently than ever before. We will have to reinvent ourselves again and again and again. And to do so, we need a certain agility. And that is, in fact, an emotional agility that lets us bridge all these transitions, and that lets us also embrace emotions that are not purely positive, but also perhaps quote unquote negative, such as sorrow or sadness. A workplace and a business is beautiful when it doesn't only aim for making you happier, but when it allows you to be sad, when it allows you to be a melancholic, which is some kind of proactive sadness, if you will, that was so beautifully described in this book, The Book of Disquiet, by the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa. And that also means that actually the qualities that we look for in managers, in leaders, is dramatically changing. I believe we want leaders who can embrace sadness and negative emotions and the dark sides of life and the fragility and vulnerability of us all. I believe that's something that has become apparently clear during the COVID-19 crisis because of politicians such as Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, who said that I don't buy that we have to be tough and ruthless in order to assert yourself or to have an impact in politics. Or Eva Karlsson, the CEO of the Swedish outdoor brand Houdini, which is a little bit like the Patagonia of Europe. She, during the crisis, was plagued with self-doubt and was wondering whether she should shut down all marketing channels. They just seemed tone deaf to her. So she entered a dialogue with the customers and said very honestly, I don't know if we should continue marketing our products when there are so many other issues that seem more important. The customer said, yes, please do it, because you're actually like a beacon to us and your stories matter, so please keep your marketing channels open. Or this gentleman here, who also epitomizes new qualities of leadership, of softer, more servant, more beautiful leadership. Jean-François Zobrist, the former CEO of the French manufacturer Favi. So he actually, in a crisis, had to let go 25% his temp workers. And he took that decision to his workforce, and in a town hall meeting basically asked everybody and said, what should I do? I probably will have to let go all of our temp workers unless we all together find a better solution. Now, what happened was that the workforce quickly assembled, and after a few hours, they had agreed to each take a 25% pay cut so that the temp workers could stay on, which shows you that sometimes it's better as a leader not to make a decision, not to know all the answers immediately, and trust the beauty and the spirit of your team. Ada Colau knows this. She's the mayor of Barcelona. She famously said that it's totally fine sometimes for me to admit that I don't have the answer. I don't have solutions. I need time to think about it, and I need the advice of others. Or Emilia Roig, the executive director of the Center for Intersectionality and Social Justice in Berlin, who really helps leaders understand that issues are always intertwined with other issues, that you can only resolve complex issues if you look at how they intersect. There are no more binary truths. That has become very clear, I believe, through the COVID crisis. Or Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, who I once heard saying at a conference, he said, I try to make as few decisions as possible. That's my leadership style. And in fact, he said, I'm very, very proud because last quarter I did not make a single decision, which means that he's not a micromanager and he trusts his team, but he's also not falling victim to this action bias that we so often see, and that is in many ways an expression of a very male, macho-dominated management culture. So all of these traits are hallmarks of a new kind of leadership that is much more comfortable with losing control, with letting go, with losing, with embracing the negative emotions, embracing the more complex, perhaps the dark side of life. So these are the three principles of beautiful business. To recap, do the unnecessary, create intimacy, and lose. And I really believe that they indicate a broader cultural shift away from the smart age to a new era, which I would call a new beautiful or a new romantic era. The smart age was characterized by data-driven, real-time decision-making. It was essentially the model of Silicon Valley that extracted data from large members of populations to create value for a few. And the principles are really shifting. I think we're moving from reacting to wondering. It's no longer only about connectivity, it's about deep connection. Planning maybe is less relevant. It's much more important now that you allow for emerging designs. And instead of control, we have to learn how to let go. Instead of big data, we should trust our big intuition. And instead of calculating risks, we should allow for vulnerability, for being heard. And instead of liking, we should endorse passion. And instead of user friendliness, even a little bit of frustration and suffering. And instead of excellence, significance. And yes, in case you wondered, beautiful business, romance, does that have a return on investment? Does that make sense from a business perspective? Yes, a wholehearted yes. First of all, innovation. Because if you don't have romantics in your organization, so people who dream big dreams, who are fools that might be often laughed at, then you will never come up with any really big disruptive ideas. You will only incrementally change. Secondly, the customer and employee experience. If you want customers or employees who fall in love with you again and again and again, not because of what you do, but because of who you are, then you need to give them more than just solutions to problems, more than just data. You need to give them drama, adventure, and romance. And I believe these qualities that I was trying to describe, empathy, intuition, imagination, and emotional agility, they're romantic qualities. And they are the tenets of a new era of beautiful business that will hopefully make us more humane. And interestingly enough, those are also the qualities of all those professions that I believe will not be replaced by machines because they are just too nuanced, too romantic, if you will, to be automated. Now, if you ask me though, what is the biggest ROI of romance, aside from the ones that I already mentioned, I would argue it's not even financial, it's not even economic. The biggest ROI of romance is more romance. The biggest ROI of beauty is more beauty. And that is important because we need it more than ever. We live in this weird age of dissonance where problems are increasingly complex and we're drowning in an abundance of data and information. But the prevailing sentiment of our time is one of loss. We're losing a sense of security, stability, identity, our story. The world is not how it presented itself just last year, obviously. And then we are connected, hyper connected to everybody, but we're lonelier and more isolated than before. And this is why it's so important that we build businesses that are not machines, but gardens, that we create products, services, and business models that are not only more useful, but also more beautiful. And I'm not only a romantic, I'm also an optimist. And I believe if we combine the power of exponential technology with those inherently human traits, which to me are very romantic traits, that then we can indeed create beautiful businesses that allow us to not only be exponentially more productive or exponentially more efficient, but perhaps a tiny little bit more human. And that is a vision for the future of work, for the future of business, and the future of our societies that hopefully not only a romantic like me can subscribe to. Thank you very much.
Wow. Tim, thank you very much. I mean, I didn't realize 30 minutes are over. I was just so engrossed in your presentation. What a fabulous session. You are the storyteller, and that everybody has been talking about. So that was a very different perspective on business, how to look at your business in such a different way and still achieve the same goal. And till date, I could never connect business and romance, passion, yes, commitment, yes, inspiration, and even love. But that was till today. Thank you very much for bringing that perspective, Tim. Thoroughly enjoyed your session,
Thank
and I'm
you.
sure a lot of
Thank
our
you.
audience would agree with me on that. Okay, so so before we get into the question answers from the audience, Tim, one question that I'd like to begin with is, um, everybody has a take on what success is and how you measure success. What is your definition of success in life and in business?
Well, good question. It is definitely constantly changing. It has to do, I guess, also with the age that you're in. I had very different definitions of success when I was younger than the ones that I have now. I would say at the end of the day, for me, it goes back to the legacy that you leave behind. At the House of Beautiful Business last year, we actually ran a session with the consultancy SY Partners that works with many big Fortune 500 brands on their vision and on their brands. And they ran a session that was based on the top regrets of the dying, which is based on a book that a former nurse wrote who spent a lot of time with the dying. And it's interesting that you may have read this in many newspaper articles. It was widely reported that those regrets of the dying are always, they're not that I should have worked more or I should have made more money or I should have gotten a bigger title or my exit package should have been better. They were always about I should have spent more time with my family. I should have spent more time with my friends. I wish I had done things that I didn't do because I was afraid. So there's certainly a theme there. So I think success in life is if you can live your life that only you can live uniquely to the fullest, without, of course, harming and inflicting harm on others. But I think at the end of the day, when you look back on what is a successful life, I would say it's a beautiful life. It's not a productive life. It's a beautiful life. It's a life where you collect a lot of memories, a lot of stardust, a lot of relationships where you learn and grow, and you just bring to the world the best version of yourselves. So maybe that's my more romantic view on what success is in life and in business as well, because it's hard to separate the two.
Yes, I mean, more so that people start identifying themselves with what they do rather than who they are. So, very well said, Tim. Thank you very much. I'll dive into the questions from audience. I expected this to be the first question, and I think we had a couple of questions of the same nature. So you spoke of the example of don't cut the orange balloons. I just love that. In the current context, when there is so much pressure on efficiencies, cost, numbers, so on and so forth, how would you really advise? And quite to the contrary, the consultants telling businesses that you got to, do away with the unnecessary if you have to stay in the game. So how do you really reconcile, what you're saying and what's happening today? How should leaders actually go about this dilemma?
It's a real dilemma. And I think the first thing I would say is, I'm a very privileged position to advise companies on those things and on culture that actually can afford to have a culture. So I know that there are self-employed entrepreneurs, freelancers, small, medium-sized enterprises in all parts of the world that are really, really struggling to survive. And if that's the case, I mean, there is no other choice in many ways than to really focus on the bottom line, on cost cutting, and make sure that you bring your team and your workforce and yourself through this marathon of a crisis. But there are a lot of organizations that thankfully still have that wiggle room. And for those, I would say, do not cut the orange balloons. Do not stop investing in culture. And in fact, consider the culture part of culture, right? It's not just an instrument to enhance productivity. It really is a culture in and of itself. And if you need a business reason to do that, then I would point back to the dot-com crash or the 2008 crisis, And there's actually a lot of research on companies, particularly also from Silicon Valley, that continue to invest, whether that is Apple or Google, in innovation, in R&D, and invested in culture to make sure that the employees stick together and the spirit of the organization wouldn't suffer. And in many cases, if not in most cases, that has shown that organizations that do that, businesses that do that, then really come out on the brighter side and build really sustainable long-term competitive advantages. But again, that depends on your ability to have a choice, right? And to say, yes, we are setting some money aside, some budgets aside. We're not going to shut down all of the innovation and R&D efforts just in order to focus on efficiency. That'll be penalized, I think, fairly in the short to midterm. Whoever thinks long term, I think, should keep investing in culture if they can.
Right. Tim, the second question, again, I was expecting from a more than a few audience, and you spoke of technology in your session. So Mayank wants to know that given that there is so much happening, there's so much talk about AI, machine learning, deep learning, everything taking over, how we work, how the jobs are being executed today. So not only people at the lower skill level, but even specialty skills are under threat. So how do you really see that happening? AI, machines, all those taking over. If that being the case, then how do you retain beauty in the business with machines? Because machines won't have empathy.
Yeah, I think there's always these two camps, right? One camp says, it's completely exaggerated. We're a far cry from singularity, from that moment at which machines might be able to outperform or outthink us, or outfeel us even, who knows. We're a far cry from so-called AGI, artificial general intelligence. We have some very narrow, fairly stupid artificial intelligence that can run tasks that are mostly efficiency driven and run them better, and can compute large amounts of data, of course, in a much faster way than humans. There is another camp that's saying, well, that is just a matter of time, how quickly we reach AGI, artificial general intelligence. It's really, all the ingredients are there. We're making exponential progress. And I mean, just, of course, the recent natural processing languages advancements that were made by OpenAI in Silicon Valley, I think indicate that this might happen sooner rather than later, and that we were going to live in a world that is auto-completed, where machines will be able to perform many of the tasks, including cognitive and perhaps even emotional tasks that we humans perform. I think there's two answers I would have to that, or two suggestions. One would be that we strengthen those qualities that make us human, and that we train people to be more generalists, or have stronger skills in those areas that I pointed out earlier, where machines will not be able to compete. I think, interestingly, those are areas that are actually often the domain of artists. So it's imagination, empathy, creativity, improvisation, agility, emotional agility. I think that's what makes us unique. It's the ability to dream big dreams and to come up with new ideas, where machines and AI and robots, of course, will have a much harder time. And I think the second thing I would say is, it is going to be a reality, in my opinion, that we will, of course, coexist with machines. It might be a symbiotic relationship. We're already seeing this, where people like Elon Musk, right, are experimenting with Neuralink and basically want to connect the brain with machines, so where the boundaries between human and machine and human and nature will become blurrier. And you could make the case, right, that we are, as the German philosopher Tobias Ries once said, we are a pond among ponds. So this whole separation between human and nature is very artificial to begin with. It has basically been a force of colonialism, if you want, which is now coming back to haunt us, because the virus is in us, nature is in us. And in that sense, if you move from a human-centered way of thinking to a much more animist and planetary way of thinking, you could argue that even AI is a creation of us. They will be partners and they will be stakeholders, and they are part of the ecosystem that we live in. And we need to find and develop a relationship with them, which perhaps is not only human-centered. So I think we're really at an interesting moment in time, where I think we've definitely become aware of the ethical implications, and there are a lot of initiatives underway in Europe and elsewhere to tackle that. But to what extent, and how fast we'll reach that point where we have AGI and with massive implications on the job market and the way we live. I mean, I would have to lie, and I'm really not an expert if I were able to predict that. There are other people much more competent who can comment on that.
And I would recommend to the audience, if they, these are questions that we often see on our platform. One of the books that I have read recently, not recently, sometime back, is Hit Refresh from Satya Nadella. That talks about the whole business of AI and our fear and how it will coexist. So that's just one for the audience. The next one, Tim, is an interesting one again. There is a lot of talk about with this pandemic, workplaces are going to change. This whole concept of remote working is now a reality, and we've heard a lot of these big organizations have already announced plans to give away or give up their workspaces. Now, that may have a profound impact on how we interact with each other in workspaces and how we build a culture. So, Jenny here wants to know if that being the case, how would you really build empathy and things that you spoke of? What tools would you have to build a culture when you're not even interacting with anybody physically?
So, like many other observers, I believe that the answer, the truth will be somewhere in the middle, right? So we will not all work from home, of course. Some people will go back to the office. We're already seeing this, I think, in many countries where parts of the workforces are actually very happy to go back because they want the social proximity of their coworkers. And for others, it's a real liberation to work from home because they have flexible schedules and they're in much better shape if they work from home. And I think it's interesting that Google announced, right, that they would not, they basically would allow their workforce to work remotely until July 2021. So Google always has very good data. So that shows you that many other organizations will probably follow suit because it's simply too risky to bring them back to the workplace. I think the remote work question is an interesting one, and it has very different implications for different genders and groups of populations, I would say. Adam Grant, the organizational behavior expert and author, he made a really interesting point a few weeks ago when he said that, for people who are already established or sort of midway through their career, more senior, have maybe 10 years under their belt, remote working might not be so difficult because they have formed the relationships with their networks and their coworkers doing these water cooler conversations at work, right? So they have the social capital, the political capital that they need to be effective even remotely. However, for newbies or people who are just entering the workforce straight out of college or start anew in an organization, for them, it's going to be so much harder to build that capital remotely, right? It's a very different thing if you smell someone, if you have dinner with them, if you spend time with them, all the informal tacit conversations you have, than just seeing them on a fairly results-oriented Zoom call. So I think for them, it's a real disadvantage to enter a workforce that is going to be fairly remote. Now, what can we do to avoid that? I think we all have to change our skill set. So again, I think we have to be careful that we don't use online conference or video platforms only to become more efficient, right? And say, well, we can cut out all of the noise. Now we're just going to be agenda item by agenda item and focus on the result. I think it's really important that if you use Zoom or other platforms, that you create these informal conversations that you maybe, as many organizations have done already, you meet for dinner or you have a conversation without agenda. You create that informal fabric that is so important to a company's culture, which means that for leaders and managers, the requirements change as well. And I touched upon that a little bit earlier in the presentation. They have to become more like painters, or maybe a better word would be curators. They're all experienced designers now at the end of the day, which is interesting because that's also a huge opportunity. So at the traditional workplace, if we ran a meeting, well, we went into a meeting room, there were some coffee cups, we went through the agenda, but did we make an effort to design this meeting like an experience? Probably not. Now on Zoom, or if you connect it through other online platforms, every meeting is an experience. Every meeting is an opportunity to inspire and to create culture. In fact, you may not have other opportunities. That's your only channel. So you better use that wisely. You better become a really good creator of experiences or an experienced designer and learn from artists, from game designers, from experienced designers. That's a really interesting new skill set that I think that we leaders, managers need to acquire.
Speaking of which, Tim, interesting one from Swapan Lekha. Does it even make sense to have 5 year or 10 year plan that we are used to? Because when you're speaking of romance, right, you don't you don't measure it in the time frame. So, what do you have to say to that?
It does not make sense, except that it's a beautiful novel, right? I think a plan is a story that we tell, and a 3 or 5 year plan is a narrative. It's a story that we tell ourselves, that we tell our team, that we tell the world. It doesn't have to be true, and it will never be fully true. It will never be fully accurate because, of course, reality will diverge from it. So in that sense, yes, I think planning is good, and it forces you to think through things. It's a thinking vehicle. But I think as long as we acknowledge that it's not reality, and that, of course, this is something I know from my experience as a chief marketing officer. We created 1 year marketing plans, but then after 2 weeks, they were obsolete and we had to adjust, right? So they give you a container or a swim lane, but the swimming will look very different. And I think through COVID, probably a lot of organizations have also come to realize that all these plans are obsolete, right? And rather than having super granular plans, and trust me, the Germans where I live, they're world champions in 5 year detailed plans. But rather than that, I think it would be helpful to be resilient and to be able to actually switch gears very quickly and have a bit of redundancy actually in your organization that you can use to then improvise and adjust to ever-changing environments. I think that's more important, these qualities, than having like a super detailed, super rigid project or strategic plan.
I'm going to shout out to our audience. They've just got a few minutes left with Tim. We've got a hard stop at 7:30. Tim has to go for another engagement. So I've got a bunch of questions on my screen. Keep them coming. You might be the lucky one whose question may be picked up. So I'm going to straight away go into the next question. Um, okay, Tim. So there is a lot of research which has been produced. Almost every year, which talks about how employees at workplace are disengaged. They're not connected, but still business happens, and business still happens well for a lot of companies. That's one part of the story. Other part of the story, you hear from employees that work is, a job is just one of the things I do, but my passion lies somewhere else. How do you really see these two things? What's happening with these two dimensions that we speak of?
Yeah, so I quoted this Gallup survey, the notorious Gallup survey, in my presentation earlier, and a lot of people are referring to that, and the numbers vary a little bit from country to country, but by and large, right, they're scaringly low. I don't know. I'm having a little bit of an issue with the numbers in this survey, because I always feel so first of all, what exactly is engagement? How consistent does that engagement have to be? Because if you're married, right, you're not engaged every single day over 20 years, but you still commit to it, and you're still happy, and it's a labor of love. And I think the same is true for a relationship with your organization, that it's not always flower and honeys, and maybe there are times and moments when you are disengaged or frustrated. So I'm not sure that metric of engagement is actually all that meaningful. I think what is the more relevant metric is to look at the well-being metrics, and we know, and that's actually quite a shocking statistic, that the number of depressions worldwide has gone up. Other mental health issues are really dramatically on the rise, suicides and so forth. So they're not all work related, but of course, because we spend so much time at work, many of them are, or at least the workplace has a role model function and can actually help address these issues by creating cultures of belonging or intimacy. And I think that maybe is the more meaningful metric. How can we create cultures that allow for intimacy, that allow ourselves to express negative emotions? So I think I'd be much more in favor of a culture where people are disengaged, but they're not afraid to share the fact that they're disengaged sometimes, than a culture that suppresses any kind of sharing of negative emotions, and people pretend to be engaged when in fact they're not. So I think we have to shift our thinking a little bit there and just look at what it means to be human at the workplace in much broader terms. Unfortunately, the discussion about that is always very much along very positivist positivist terms. And I think it's a little bit of an American issue as well, because I think the American culture is very positive, right? So you have to be happy and optimistic, and that's being rewarded. The European culture is different. I don't know other cultures in the world all that much. But I think that's the shift we need, moving away from a purely positivist culture. And then I think, with different metrics, capture whether that shift has been successful or not.
Great. Thanks, Tim. I think this time for one last question before we formally thank you once again. Tim, so we got a lot of our listeners who have joined today are either they're management students or they're people who are in early part of their career. So what would be your advice to them? I'm also going to just ask in the context of what's happening, things are going to change, around us. If not profoundly, definitely a lot of things may change. So what would be your advice in terms of what they should be focusing on if they want to build a successful career going forward?
I don't know. I have any advice for young people, because they may have as much advice for me as I have for them. But anyway, what I would tell them maybe is the first thing is find your purpose. Find your purpose. Know who you are and know what you want to do and what success looks like for you. And that might be very different for you than for your friend or for your colleague. But be very clear about that, and then do only things, if you can. I know that's a privilege, but if you can and you have a choice, then only do things that you're really passionate about, where you can make a difference. The second thing is acquiring all those skills that I had mentioned earlier. So I think becoming more like an artist, becoming more like a painter, an experienced designer, a curator, thinking more about the interactions and how you can create cultures of intimacy and belonging at work, but also beyond. I think that's maybe one of the most important skill sets that I've observed to make you happier and, if you will, successful in your career in life. And the third thing I would say is, and this is something I tell my daughter, who is growing up, English and German, because my wife is American and I grew up in Germany. I think it doesn't matter which language you learn or which other discipline or subject matter you're an expert in, but just make sure that it's more than one. So that you realize that there's always another world out there, that there's always another perspective, and there's always another truth. And my truth is not the only one, and it's not absolute. And I think if you speak two different languages or three, or you travel, or you read, or you surround yourself with people who are not always like-minded, then you're much more capable of shifting your thinking and developing a humility, I think, that puts you in place a little bit in relation to the world. And that is probably a quality that is going to be more important going forward. So those would be my three pieces of advice, or at least things that I have learned.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think there are a lot of questions which I couldn't ask you today. Would you want to share with our viewers as to where they can find you, follow you, know more about the work that you do?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, thanks so much for having me, Rakesh. I really appreciate it, and thanks for all the questions. So yeah, you can find me at timleberecht.com, and then you can find the House of Beautiful Business at houseofbeautifulbusiness.com. And in fact, you are all very much invited to join us for the Great Wave. Now, never mind, that is a theme that we picked last year in December. We had no idea, of course, what was going to happen. But we are still hosting the Great Wave, and it's going to be a beautiful wave. And it's a hybrid festival, online and offline, with 30 local hubs around the world, one of them also in Bangalore, bringing together thousands of people from October 16th to 19th to basically think about what it means to run a beautiful business and how we can rebuild the economy in the wake of this crisis in a different way. So go to the website, thegreatwave.house, and look it up, and then register if you're so inclined. We'd love to have you join.
Super. Thank you so much, Tim. It's just bang on time. It was a great session. It was lovely having you. Very thought-provoking perspective. I'm sure our audience have just enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you very much, Tim, for accepting our invite and being with us today. Wish you all the best and stay safe.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You too. Take care.
All right. As always, all good things come to an end. I thoroughly enjoyed this session. I hope you really found it useful too. For all our audiences who are looking at getting into business, I think you could do with what Tim had to share today about how to make business more human and make businesses beautiful. Don't forget to join us next week on 26th of August, 6:30 p.m. at the same time. We have Herman Simon, another thought-provoking session, another superb speaker. We're going to talk about pricing and profits, especially in these times of crisis. So you don't want to miss that if you are running a business or you're interested in business. Before I sign off, a big thank to our knowledge support partner, etbrandequity.com, for being with us, supporting us. And a big thank you to all our community support partners, AdGully, Resulticks, Paul Writer, Netcore, and Shoolini University. Thank you very much, guys, for being with us. Stay safe, stay happy, and stay healthy. So the two lucky winners for today's session is one is Jenny Andrews. So Jenny, congratulations uh, for asking us the winning question. Please let us know your email ID so we can ship the voucher to you. And the second question is Mayank Shahabadi. This was a question on AI, machine learning, and how this is going to impact all that Tim was saying. So, congratulations, Mayank. Congratulations, Jenny. Please send us your email IDs and we will ship the vouchers to you. Thank you very much once again, guys. Stay safe and stay healthy.